Hi, my name's Mark, and today I'm going to walk you through the grain stitch from Camilla Vad's Field Sweater. Whether you plan to work the pullover, cardigan, or vest version of this pattern, today we'll break down the grain stitch step by step to give you plenty of practice before jumping into your project. If you've stumbled upon this video and you're not already familiar with the Field Sweater by Camilla Vad, let's head to Ravelry to look at the pattern details. If you're not already a Ravelry user, I can't recommend the site highly enough. Ravelry is a fantastic resource of patterns. I think there are hundreds of thousands there in the database, and it also works as a sort of social media site where people can post pictures and comments on their finished products. I've entered Field Sweater into the search box, which gives us over 200 results. If I needed to filter this down, I could use the options along the left-hand side of the page to filter based on type of craft, knit versus crochet, weight of yarn, difficulty rating, and several other filters. You'll notice that the pattern here has a heart next to it, and that's because I've already saved this into my favorites. Making a profile in Ravelry is completely free, and it allows you to save patterns that you might want to do in the future into your favorites. And once you purchase patterns, it keeps them all organized in one folder. Here I can see the price of the pattern, as well as several other features at a quick glance. I'm looking specifically for the weight of yarn, which in this case is DK. I'm also going to look for the needle size used, which is both a US 4 and a US 6. I'm also looking at the sizes available and the general range of yardage needed. Once I scroll down, I'll see a more specific breakdown of the measurements and sizes, as well as the specific yardage needed for each size. One of the most important things to do with any project is to choose an appropriate size, as well as carefully calculating the total amount of yarn needed before you start the project. One of the most helpful resources on these Ravelry postings is the number of pictures included with a pattern. Here we have pictures included from the designer, which show the sweater in a couple of different colorways and fiber contents. But a further tool is to scroll to the top of the page and follow the Projects tab. Once on that Projects tab, we'll see several examples of Ravelry users who have completed this project and posted their own pictures and potentially their own comments on the pattern or the process. I find it extremely helpful to see what regular Ravelry users have chosen to make this sweater out of, to see what their finished products look like. I take note of the size, the texture, which colors work well, and it's nice to see if anyone has comments on whether or not the pattern gave them any issues. Similar to the Project tab, there's a Comment tab where users can leave feedback on the pattern or their experience. Before we jump into the grain stitch tutorial, I want to make sure that you're working this swatch in the round. Since we don't have enough stitches on our needle to connect in the round, we'll work on circulars, and at the end of each row, we'll slide our work from one end of the needles to the other. Here I'll pull on the needle so that my swatch ends up at the other end, ready to be worked again on the right side. This will affect our tension, as working in the round often results in a different tension than working a flat piece. It also allows us to follow right side instructions for every row. I'll draw my yarn across, making sure to leave enough space that it doesn't buckle my swatch. This technique allows me to work right side instructions every time. Now to break down those grain stitches. I'm using a US 6 or 4 millimeter circular knitting needle and DK weight yarn. In this example, I'm using Scout from Kelbourne Woolens, and my needle is a Chiaogoo Redlace needle. I'm going to cast on 28 stitches, which gives me 4 border stitches at each edge and 20 stitches across which I'll practice this grain. I'm placing a marker after my 4 border stitches, and then I'll count 5 knit stitches before placing my next marker. Our grain stitch pattern works in repeats of 5 stitches, so as you learn this stitch, I would recommend putting a marker every 5 stitches. In this row, we're knitting every stitch, and at my borders, I'm using a seed stitch. If you're following the pattern along with me, I'm on page 4 of the Field Sweater pullover version, and I'm beginning with round 1 of the pattern. We'll repeat rounds 1 through 4 on loop to practice these grains. Our first instruction is to knit 1 stitch. After that, we'll make our first grain by pulling up a loop as if to knit, following with a yarn over, and knitting once more all through the same stitch. Once we have 3 loops pulled up, we'll remove the stitch from the left-hand needle. Next, we'll knit the following stitch through the back loop to twist it. Then we'll make 1 more grain. We pull up a large loop, yarn over, and pull up a 3rd large loop all through the same stitch. Once we have 3 loops on the right-hand needle, we can pull the stitch off the left-hand needle. We finish the repeat with a knit stitch. Now we repeat that 5-stitch pattern. Knit 1, make a grain by pulling up a large loop, yarn over, and pull up an additional loop. That's 3 loops out of 1 stitch. Knit through the back loop, make a grain, and knit the final stitch. These 5 stitches repeat over and over. Here we are in slow motion. Pulling up a large loop about twice as big as my normal knit stitch, matching it with a large yarn over, and finishing with another large knit stitch. Making this stitch large enough will allow us to pass these stitches on future rounds, and later cable them and resolve the grains by knitting them together. Make sure as you practice that you make a very large grain. If they're too tight, they're almost impossible to work into in future rounds. Round 2 begins with a knit 1. Then our next instruction is to slip all 3 loops of the grain stitch without changing the orientation of each loop. So we're slipping purlwise. Then we knit the next stitch through the back leg to twist it. For the next grain, we slip those 3 loops purlwise. And we knit the final stitch. That's our 5-stitch repeat for round 2. As you practice round 2, it can speed up the process by slipping all 3 stitches of the grain together, if that's something that you feel comfortable doing. Just be careful as you slip them that you're not dropping any of the loops. Next, we'll work round 3. Round 3 is the most involved of any of the instructions, so be patient, take your time. We start by taking the first stitch and placing it on a cable needle, holding it to the back. Next, we'll knit all 3 legs of our grain stitch together, knitwise. I'll insert my needle from left to right, making sure to catch all 3 loops before knitting them together and resolving the grain. After that, I'll knit the stitch from the cable needle. Our center stitch will be slipped in this round, and the next grain will be passed to our cable needle. Be careful that you pass all 3 loops and none are dropped. This time we'll hold the cable needle to the front of the work. Once there, we'll knit the next stitch on our working needle. At this point, we need to resolve the grain by knitting all 3 loops together through the back leg of each stitch. I'm going to pass the legs of the grain back onto my stainless steel needles as they're much sharper than my blunt cable needle. Once there, I'll insert my needle to stretch the grain stitches open before knitting them through the back leg. Once knit, we've resolved our second grain stitch. You can see that this leaves us with 5 stitches, just like our original count. We repeat these instructions, taking the first stitch and holding it to the back, before knitting the next 3 loops of the grain. The first grain is always knit knitwise from left to right, while the second grain of each grouping is always knit through the back leg of the stitches. Once again, I'm slipping those loops back onto my stainless steel needles, just because it's easier for me to get through all 3 loops. And we're left with 5 stitches. When I work cable patterns, I prefer to work without a cable needle, so I'll break down my process here. Instead of holding the first stitch to the back, I'm going to reach past it and secure all 3 loops of my grain with my right hand needle. I'll pinch underneath the knit stitch, letting it float for just a second before I secure it with my left hand needle. I'll replace the grain stitch onto the left needle, now having switched the place of my first 2 stitches. I knit all 3 legs of the grain together and knit my second stitch. We slip the center stitch, and instead of holding my grain to the front on a cable needle, I'll reach behind and past, entering the final stitch knitwise, working the stitch, squeezing underneath the grain, and letting it float for just a second before catching all 3 legs on my left needle. Now my final step is to knit those 3 legs of the grain together, all through the back. It gives me the same result, and with my technique and hold, it feels more comfortable than using a cable needle. Now we're reaching the end of round 3. It definitely takes more time. We have to be careful that we catch all the legs of our grains as we cable. Round 4 is our reward. Here we're knitting every stitch, making sure that we knit the center of each group of 5 through the back leg to twist. Again, that's knit, knit, knit through the back loop, and knit, knit. Keeping these markers between each group of 5 lets me notice if I've made any mistakes at any point in this 4-round repeat. I'd recommend practicing this repeat of 4 rounds until you feel really confident with making your grains. Now let's take a look at the swatch. You can see the grains, they look like baubles or clumps of stitches, and they emerge from this center stem. The stem is where we're twisting the stitches by either slipping or knitting through the back leg. Once we cable, we're taking those grains out in a twisted fashion from the stem. Next, we'll look at making a large grain. After knitting the first stitch, we'll make the grain by pulling up a large knit, yarning over an equal size, pulling up a third loop, yarning over again, and pulling up a final loop before moving that stitch off of our left-hand needle. Here we've created 5 loops out of 1 stitch. This is our large grain. It's important to make sure these loops are big so that we can slip them on future rounds and later cable them and knit them together to resolve. Start by pulling up a large loop as if to knit, yarning over, pulling up another large loop, yarning over once more, and ending with one final loop as if to knit. We finish the 5-stitch repeat with a knit. The pattern works identically here to the regular grains, except we're making them larger by adding 1 additional yarn over and 1 additional knit. Begin by knitting 1 stitch before making a large grain. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 loops of our grain. Knit the next stitch through the back leg. Pull up 5 for our next large grain. And knit the final stitch. We repeat this pattern across the row. Round 2 will work just like round 2 of our regular sized grains. We knit 1 before slipping all 5 loops of the grain from our left to right needle. You can pass these individually, making sure that you have all 5, or if it's comfortable for you, you can pass them as a unit. We'll knit the center stitch through the back leg before slipping our next grain. The final stitch of this repeat is knit. Again, that's knit 1, slip the 5 loops of the large grain, knit through the back leg, slip the next large grain, and knit the final stitch. Here, I'll attempt to slip as a unit. You have to be careful that you're catching all 5 loops, so this may not be any faster for you. It just depends on what feels comfortable. We knit through the back leg of the center stitch, and we slip the next large grain, knitting the final stitch. Round 3 will be just as tedious, if not more, than with our regular sized grains. We'll start by taking the first stitch, placing it on a cable needle, and holding it to the back of our work. Next, we'll knit all 5 loops of the large grain together knitwise. Here I'm stretching those loops so that I can more easily insert my needle from left to right, trying not to snag any of the loops as I do so. We knit those together, finishing the grain stitch. Next, we'll knit the stitch from our cable needle. The center stitch is slipped, and the next grain is placed on the cable needle and held to the front. Again, making sure that we get all 5 loops of that grain. We hold those to the front of the work and knit the next stitch on the needle. I'll pass the 5 loops of the large grain back to my stainless steel needle. As a reminder, I'm doing this because the tips of my stainless steel needles are much sharper than the blunt end of my cable needle. Now, I'll stretch these open and knit all 5 loops together through the back leg. Take your time, it's a lot of stitches to knit together. Then we're left with 5 stitches in our pattern. We'll repeat this set of instructions across the remaining groups of 5 on our swatch. Holding the first knit stitch to the back on a cable needle, we'll knit all 5 legs of the grain together from left to right as if to knit. And we'll knit the stitch from the cable needle. Slip the center stitch. Then place the next 5 loops of the large grain on our cable needle, and this time hold them to the front. And we'll knit the next stitch on our needle. I'll place those 5 loops of the grain back on my stainless steel needle. If you're working with a sharper cable needle, you could knit them directly off of it. And I'll knit these all through the back leg. As before, I'll show you how I prefer to do this without a cable needle. I'll reach past my first knit stitch, securing the grain, letting that first stitch float before securing it with the left-hand needle. Then I'll replace the grain on the left-hand needle. I'll knit those 5 legs together and knit the next stitch on my needle. Slip the center stitch, reach behind and past the grain, knitting the final stitch, squeezing underneath the large grain as I let those float and catch them. For me, it speeds up the process, but it's not for everyone. This brings us to round 4. Just like before, we'll knit the first 2 stitches, knit the third through the back leg, and knit the final 2 stitches regularly. We'll continue this across the row. Here we can take a look at the size of our grains. We have the large grain up top and below it a regular grain. The large grain of course has 2 extra loops to it, so it makes our bauble larger. Now I'll demonstrate these steps holding a mohair. We'll create the grain the same way. This is a regular grain consisting of 3 loops. We knit 1, yarn over, knit again through the same stitch, giving us 3 loops of the grain. I think mohair is a beautiful addition to the yoke of this sweater, but I will say that it complicates things. Instead of looking at 3 stitches across that grain, I now technically have 6 strands of fiber, 3 mohair and 3 wool, which means when I slip these stitches, cable them, and knit them together, I'm always capturing twice the number of strands, which can complicate things at times. That's knit 1, make a grain, pull up a loop knitwise, yarn over, pull up another loop, giving us 3 of the grain, knit 1 through the back leg, make an additional grain, pull up a large loop, yarn over, pull up a final loop, and we knit the final stitch. Now for round 2, we'll slip the grains we've just made. We begin with a knit 1, then slip the 3 loops of the grain stitch, knit the next stitch through the back leg, slip the 3 loops of the grain, and knit the final stitch. Knit 1, slip the grain, knit through the back leg, slip the grain, and knit the final stitch. We can slip them as a unit if you've made them big enough. And we repeat across the row. Now for our most involved round, round 3, we hold the first stitch to the back, making sure to secure both the mohair and the wool. I'll stretch my 3 stitches of the grain before knitting them from left to right, making sure not to skewer any extra strands. After resolving that grain, I'll knit my stitch from the cable needle. We slip the center stitch, place the next grain on a cable needle, and hold it to the front of the work. After knitting the next stitch on the needle, I'll replace the grain on my stainless steel needles, and I'll knit those through the back leg. We'll repeat those instructions, holding the first stitch to the back of the work, stretching the grain, then knitting it from left to right, knitwise. Knitting the stitch off of the cable needle, slipping the center stitch, placing the next grain onto the cable needle, and holding that to the front of the work before knitting the final stitch. Now I'll knit those 3 legs of the grain through the back loop. As always, that leaves us with 5 stitches in our pattern. Here I'll work without a cable needle, following the same instructions from the first 2 demonstrations. And that completes round 3. Just as before, round 4 will be used to knit across all stitches, knit the first 2, knit the 3rd stitch through the back leg, and knit the final 2 stitches, and we repeat that across our row. Now we can take a look at our swatch. We can follow the center stem of twisted stitches, around which we have the grains, both large and regular, twisting away with those cables. It's a really beautiful texture. I'm partial to it with the mohair, but it also looks nice in one color just as a textured knit. Here we can look at my completed sweater. I chose to use mohair both in the collar and in the yoke. I also had enough left over that I used it in my cuffs and the hem of the sweater. If I follow the grains down, I can see that center stem of elongated and twisted stitches. And because of the increases, we end up with stems both between groups of grains and in the center where the grains emerge. You can see that here. If you notice, we have large grains at the bottom of the yoke, and between these large grains we have sections of stockinette stitch where the color is not held. So if you're working a colorwork version of this sweater, you'll have to split your runner or your mohair from the wool when you get to these stretches, which can be a little complicated. It just depends on what you have in mind for your version of this sweater. I think both versions work pretty beautifully. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this video. I hope you found that it was a helpful resource in breaking down these grains. If it's your first time here on the channel, I'd appreciate you taking the time to like, leave a comment, or subscribe to the channel for future videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!